You know what's genuinely strange when you stop and look at it clearly? An entire generation was told, repeatedly and sincerely, that they were special, that they could be anything. That effort and achievement were the reliable currency of a good life. They believed it. They worked hard, harder, in many cases, than anyone actually expected them to. And they ended up unable to afford the same version of normal that the generation directly before them treated as a reasonable baseline. That's not a complaint. That's a psychology experiment nobody signed up for. I'm talking about millennials, people born between 1981 and 1996. And before the eye rolls start, stay with this, because it gets uncomfortable in ways that go considerably deeper than the usual conversation. The Pew Research Center confirmed in 2020 that millennials became the first generation in modern American history expected to be financially worse off than the generation that raised them, which means there is an entire demographic, tens of millions of people, walking through their daily lives, carrying a bizarre psychological cocktail of genuine achievement and persistent failure simultaneously. Not one or the other, both, at the same time, every day. The psychological term for holding two fundamentally contradictory beliefs at once is cognitive dissonance. And millennials are not just experiencing it, they are swimming in it. Psychologist Jean Twenge spent years studying this exact phenomenon, and what she found in her research is the kind of thing that sounds almost too on the nose until you realize it's simply accurate. Millennials score higher on narcissism measures than previous generations. They were raised, after all, in an era of unprecedented self-esteem, investment, helicopter parenting, participation trophies, constant reinforcement that their feelings and potential were extraordinary. But here's the part that actually matters. They also score significantly higher on anxiety and depression. So what you're looking at is a generation that was systematically trained to believe they were exceptional, and then placed in conditions that made them feel chronically inadequate. A generation that simultaneously thinks they're special and feels completely worthless. Outsized confidence and persistent self-doubt occupying the same nervous system at the same time. Someone once called it a trauma response with a LinkedIn profile. That is not an exaggeration. To understand why this happened, you have to look at the actual timeline, because the timing is everything. Millennials were the test subjects for the self-esteem movement. They grew up being told by teachers, parents, and the broader culture that their feelings mattered enormously, that they were each uniquely gifted, that everyone deserved a trophy for showing up. Not because anyone was malicious. These were earnest attempts at better parenting, built on genuine research that low self-esteem produced bad outcomes. The intention was real. The execution had consequences nobody fully mapped. And then they hit their 20s right as the economy imploded. 2008. The whiplash alone should have hospitalized people. The generation raised to expect the most walked into the worst economic conditions in living memory. And instead of recalibrating the expectations, instead of acknowledging the structural shift, the dominant cultural message stayed remarkably consistent. Work harder, be more entrepreneurial, optimize your personal brand, develop a side hustle, and if you're still struggling, the problem is your mindset. That is a profound mismatch between reality and narrative. And the human mind, when it lives inside a profound mismatch for long enough, does not stay neutral. It breaks down. The exhaustion has layers, and each one compounds the ones beneath it. The first layer is cognitive dissonance. Holding two contradictory truths simultaneously is one of the most metabolically expensive things a mind can do. The belief that hard work produces proportional outcomes, a belief installed in childhood, reinforced throughout education, runs continuously against the lived evidence that it doesn't. Not consistently. Not reliably. Not enough to explain the gap between what was promised and what arrived. Every day that gap persists. The mind spends energy it cannot recover managing the contradiction between what it was taught to expect and what it keeps experiencing. That expenditure is invisible. It doesn't show up on any productivity metric. But it is real, and it is continuous, and it never fully stops. The second layer is performance fatigue. with no backstage. Millennials encountered social media not as children, the way the generations after them did, but as teenagers and young adults, exactly when identity is forming, exactly when the question of who you are and whether that is acceptable is most raw and most urgent. Facebook arrived in 2004, Instagram in 2010. What this means, practically, is that millennials learn to be adults while simultaneously learning to perform their lives for an audience. The two processes became intertwined in a way that was genuinely unprecedented. Psychologist Tim Kasser's research on materialism and well-being found that when self-worth becomes anchored to external validation, which is architecturally what social media trains mental health deteriorates reliably. The result is something that functions like running a permanent campaign for your own existence. The polls never close, and the exhaustion of never having a backstage, never being fully off, never existing in a moment that isn't theoretically observable, accumulates in ways that standard rest cannot address. The third layer is the optimization trap, and this one is particularly precise in its cruelty. The self-help industry found millennials at their most depleted, offered them a solution that required more effort. Optimize your sleep, optimize your morning routine, optimize your gut health, your social media consumption, your breath, measure everything, improve everything. Every area of life became a performance domain with its own metrics and its own failure modes. Writer Anne Helen Peterson, in her landmark 2019 essay on millennial burnout, identified what she called the core mechanism. Millennials aren't burned out from working too hard. They're burned out from trying to optimize every aspect of their lives, as if it were a work project. Even rest became something to do correctly. The result is a generation that knows more about sleep hygiene than any previous cohort in history and is more exhausted. There is also, underneath all of this, a layer of grief that rarely gets named as such. The first generation expected to be financially worse off than the generation before it. Confirmed by Pew Research in 2020 is also a generation that was raised to expect more. The marriage was delayed, not from indifference, but from economic impossibility. The house was not purchased not from lack of wanting, but from lack of access. If you've recognized yourself anywhere in this, the exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix, the achievement that never lands the way it was supposed to, the sense of running hard on a treadmill that keeps accelerating, you are not broken. You are responding exactly the way humans respond when the ground shifts beneath them, and the map they were handed stops matching the territory they're standing in. That's not a character flaw. That's an adaptation. Imperfect, exhausted, still trying adaptation, but adaptation nonetheless. If this kind of psychological depth is what you come here for, subscribe, because this is exactly what we do here. If you're a millennial, what's the single expectation you were handed growing up that turned out to be the furthest from the reality you actually encountered? Leave it in the comments. You might be surprised how many people are describing the exact same gap.